All right, back again. This time, although I have been picking away at the Franken Panther project, I'm not going to talk about that. We're going to do something different today. We're going to work on a Triumph 500 cylinder head. One of the guys in Atlantic Vintage Motorcycle Society asked me to change out the valve guides and the valves on this little head. So as you can see, we've got a drift here for driving the old ones out and driving the new ones in. This has driven a lot of valves in and out. I must have made this about 20 years ago, and it's had a lot of use. The end gets mushroomed sometimes, and I need to machine it down smooth again. You could use a grinder for that, but why use a grinder when you have a lathe? The owner of this cylinder head sandblasted it to clean it up, and I lapped the surface here where it mates with the cylinder block to get a good smooth surface back again there. If you're the kind of person who wants to sandblast something like this, you can do it, but I'd never do this in my shop. I don't believe that engine internals and sandblasting should be mentioned in the same sentence. So if you have to sandblast something, if you're that concerned about getting it cleaned up, make sure that you have removed every bit of that blasting media, especially from the inside surfaces like around the push rod tube entryways and that sort of thing, and where the intake valve would come in this way. You don't want any sort of media left. And again, on the other side here where the springs go, you want to make sure you have cleaned this out meticulously, because you don't want any sandblasting media on the inside of this engine. I've seen it ruin engines in a matter of minutes just by somebody forgetting. Even an oil tank, or if you have an oil and frame bike, don't use a sandblaster on them. Anyway, and that's beside the point. I have the old barbecue going out on the deck. That's what I'm going to heat up this cylinder head in. I'm going to heat it up to about 425, 450 degrees. I'll use my my little temperature gauge. I forget what you call those things now. Anyway, you just point and shoot, and it tells you what the temperature is. Anyhow, there's the guides. I'm going to take them in, put them in the freezer. I've got the barbecue going on the deck, so I'm going to put this head in the barbecue, heat that up, cool down those new valve guides. When I get out here, this is time sensitive, so I won't be able to take a videos while I'm doing this because it has to happen quick. Bring it out here as soon as it comes out of the barbecue. Knock those valve guides out while it's good and hot, and while it's still good and hot, I'll insert these new valve guides. I'll probably put some red thread locker on them just to make sure they stay in place, because there's not a lot of meat up in here in the cylinder head on these Triumphs that actually holds those valve guides in. So the more help you can give them, the better. Anyway, like I say, I'm off to the freezer. I'm going to put those valve guides in there, and while I'm doing that, I'll put that head in the old barbecue there and get that warmed up, and I'll come back and show you what it looks like after I've replaced the valve guides. Hey, here we are in the old barbecue. You could do this in the wife's oven, but I really wouldn't recommend that because it'll stink up the house and you'll get in a lot of trouble. Believe me, I know. Anyway, I remember what this is called. It's a, oh, come on, Bruce, what's it called? It's an infrared thermometer, yeah. You just point it at the item you want to measure the temperature of, and it's just warming up there now. Gotta hold it steady. So it's got a ways to go. It's only about 83 degrees, but hey, it's a nice day here in Nova Scotia. The sun is shining. It's February 16th, and it's 14 degrees out here. That's why I decided to do this today. So it's a good day to do it. It's unusual to get this kind of a day in February in this part of the world. And there we go. We've got the old valve guides right there. And I've drifted in the new ones with the drift. I took that head back out to the barbecue after I took the old valve guides out, just to make sure that I hadn't lost too much heat off the head. So yeah, I rewarmed it, made sure it was still good and hot before I put the guides in, and I put a little bit of that red thread lock on them. And anyway, now the interesting part comes, because sometimes these valve guides, especially on Triumphs, remember I mentioned there's not an awful lot of meat. Excuse the old steaming gloves, I'll take them off. I used to wear them when I was in the Navy in the boiler room and stuff. Good for handling hot valves, and that was, what, 20 years ago now that I got out. I still have some of the gloves anyway. But anyhow, like I say, these have to now be reamed and to fit the new valves. And I'll show you how to do that in a little while. But, like, what was I going to say now? Oh, yes, there's not a lot of meat up around the head here, and it's thicker on one side than the other, so sometimes these valve guides don't go in quite straight, and you wind up having to cut the valve seats as well, especially, like I say, on Triumphs. There's not a lot of meat there. Anyway, I'll put the camera down for now, and I'll get out the reamer and let this head cool off a bit so I can handle it, and then we'll go ahead and ream those valve guides and find out where we got to go from there. Okay, you can see from those chips right down there that I've started reaming these holes out. That's a 5/16 reamer. It's not brand new, but I've had that, geez, I'll bet you I've had that 20 years anyways. Anyhow, it's still good and sharp, as you can see from the cuttings in here. And I use, and just about any kind of oil for a lubricant when I'm doing this. And of course, these turn clockwise from the top, like a drill. When you screw them in, that's how they cut. Don't turn them backwards. That will tend to dull them. And like I say, I just like to put a little bit of something to cool and lubricate those cutters while it's going in. Anyway, it doesn't matter which side of these valve guides you come in from. I like to come in from the top on these Triumphs because, you know, there's a nice flat surface there where it can sit on, and the darn thing isn't flopping around all over the place, and it's easy to do. Anyway, I'm going to run those that reamer in and out of those guides, and then I'll see how the valves are. Okay, I've ran the reamer through that first valve guide. This is one of the exhaust valves here. And I'm going to drop that in down about a 1/4 inch away from the valve seat. And I'm going to see if I can feel any movement at all. You should, if the valve guide is dry, you don't have any oil in there, you should be able to feel just the slightest amount of movement. And if there was motor oil in that valve, you wouldn't be able to feel any movement at all. You don't want them too tight, or they may grab, especially if they're cast iron valve guides. Like a lot of these old British bikes had cast iron valve guides in them, and what tends to happen after a few heat cycles is that the valve guide bore will actually shrink and grab the valve. So on those cast iron valve guides, you have to run the reamer up and in and out of there a couple of times and get that valve a little bit looser than it should be for a new valve, so that the guide does not tighten up and grab the valve. But on these bronze guides, you don't need to worry about that. Now here you can tell the difference between the reamed valve guide and one that hasn't been reamed. There's two reasons for that. They machined them just slightly undersized to begin with, but when everything starts to cool off here in the head, like this is just warm enough now that I can put my hand on it and not burn myself, but you couldn't hold on to it for a long time. I'm guessing it's probably about 125 degrees, maybe 130. That's Fahrenheit, by the way. But like I say, when they cool off, the aluminum has, I think, a 5-to-1 expansion ratio compared to steel. Now, bronze is pretty similar to steel as far as expansion goes. That's why you heat up a head before you knock your valve guides out. Anyway, yeah, they have to be reamed out because they are machined slightly smaller, and because the head actually grabs them and makes them that much smaller too. So I'm going to go ahead with those last 3 valve guides and ream them out. And like I say, then we're going to have to check and make sure these valves are actually contacting the seat the way they're supposed to. If not, I'm going to have to cut the seats on Triumph engines. I quite often have to do that. So we'll see what's going to happen. Okay, I've started checking the valve seats and lapping them in after doing those valve guides. Anyway, as I expected, this one here, the seat looks good. It's not pitted or anything, and I got a nice, perfect little ring of bluing around there after I had lapped the valve in. However, this guy next door, let me take this cutter guide out of here first. Whoops, there we go. As you can probably see that if I get up close enough, that seat is quite pitted. So I'm going to have to cut that seat in order to get a nice smooth seat, and I may go back and redo this one just because if I did one I might as well do the other, but I don't have to do that one. Anyway, we'll see how much I have to take off of this one. Anyway, in order to do that, I have 2 options. I have a really old valve grinder set that a good friend of mine gave me years ago. It's really, really old, but it works. I quite often do valves in that thing. And underneath all the junk under the bench, there's a box with the seat grinder in there. It's an elliptical seat grinder. That also works, but the easiest way to do it is with one of these New Way seat cutter kits. What you get with it is a pretty simple little outfit. You get this guide for 5/16 valves. You can make up guides for different size valves if you need to. I've had to do that once or twice. That just goes into the guide like that, and then you tighten it up. It's a sort of a little collet affair. You tighten that up, that's in there good and steady. Then you have 3 cutter heads. Now this one has 2 sides, and this one still in here has 1. Now, how many degrees is that? 60 degrees. This is the one that's got the 45 degree or 46 degree for your seat. And this is for the entryway. What is that one? How many degrees? It'll say on there 31 degrees. So you can get a nice 3-angle valve job, you know, just like the racers do with this thing, and it works really good. All you do is you drop that on over that guide like that. You open up the box and get the handy dandy little handle out of there to turn it with, and this just fits on over there like a deep socket, and this fits into the other end, and you just turn. Everything's turning. Anyway, it's pretty hard to do this while I hold the phone, but I'm just going to turn it a few times to give you an idea. You can hear it cutting away at the seat. I'm just going to do this a few times, then I'll stop and pull this off and see what I've got. Now you can see that's already starting to cut at the seat, so that's what I wanted to do. I'm going to keep on doing that with this 45 degree cutter until I get a nice seat, and then I'll trim it up with the 32 and the 60 degree cutters. Anyway, I'll let you see what I've got done after I'm finished with this, because I can't really hold the phone and do this job at the same time. Besides, it takes a while and it would just be boring. Okay, I've got those valve seats all nicely cut and lapped and blued. I check my valve seats with bluing after I lap them to make sure I have a really nice contact seal all the way around. All I do with that is I take some of this Prussian bluing. This old tube's probably 30 years old. There's probably another 15 years worth of bluing in that, maybe even more, because you don't use very much at all. All you do is you put a little tiny bit on the valve face, and you should be able to see through it. If you can't see through that bluing, you've got way too much on there. And you can trick yourself into thinking you have a good seat when you don't. So just remember that. Just a very light coat of bluing. You put the valve in there, you push down on it, give it about a quarter turn, pull it out, and what you should see is that nice little blue ring where the valve seats against the valve seat itself. One other thing I wanted to mention, you might want to run that reamer through there again after the heads cool off, because sometimes they tighten up a little bit when they come down to room temperature. But anyway, I didn't have to do it this time because they didn't tighten up. But they call this a hand reamer for a reason. Don't put an electric drill on it. That's not what they're for. You could dull them, break them, overheat them, wind up with valve guides that are as worn out as the old ones you took out. So don't resist the urge to use a drill on them. Anyway, now it'll be time to get this head over in the parts washer and give it a really, really, really good cleanup before I put the valves and the springs in there and reassemble this head.